It's January 15, 1919, and the streets of Boston's North End are filled with the sounds of everyday life. People are going about their daily business, unaware of the disaster that is about to strike. Suddenly, a massive wave of molasses comes crashing down, sweeping everything in its path. The wave is over 25 feet high and traveling at an estimated 35 miles per hour, destroying buildings, horses, and people. Panic sets in as people scramble to get out of the way, but it's too late. The molasses is everywhere, sticking to everything it touches, making it impossible to escape. As the wave recedes, the true extent of the damage becomes clear. But what could have caused such a disaster? And then the screams started, echoing through the streets as the reality of the situation sunk in. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back. The Purity Distilling Company, the owner of the molasses tank, had been a fixture in the North End for years. The company had been producing molasses, a key ingredient in the production of rum, since 1915. The tank, which held over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, was a familiar sight in the neighborhood, and people had grown accustomed to its presence. The people of the North End went about their daily lives, unaware of the potential danger lurking in their midst. Children played in the streets, while their parents worked in the local factories and shops. It was a typical working-class neighborhood with a strong sense of community. But beneath the surface, there were warning signs. The tank had been leaking for months, and the company had been warned about the potential risks. But no one expected what was to come. As the days passed, the leaks continued, and the company's response was inadequate, setting the stage for the disaster that would soon unfold. The Great Molasses Flood occurred during a time of great change and upheaval in the United States. World War I had just ended, and the country was struggling to adjust to the new reality. The war effort had put a strain on the economy, and many companies were struggling to stay afloat. The Purity Distilling Company was no exception. The company had been producing molasses for the war effort, and with the war over, they were left with a large surplus of molasses. The tank, which was originally designed to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses, was not designed to hold the weight of the molasses, and it was only a matter of time before disaster struck. On January 15, 1919, the temperature in Boston was unseasonably warm, with a high of 46 degrees Fahrenheit. The warm weather had caused the molasses to expand, putting additional pressure on the tank. As the day wore on, the pressure became too much, and the tank ruptured, sending a wave of molasses through the streets of the North End. The disaster was about to get worse, as the cleanup efforts would soon reveal. In the months leading up to the disaster, there were warning signs that something was wrong. The tank had been leaking for months, and the company had been warned about the potential risks. But the company's response was inadequate, and the leaks continued. The people of the North End had grown accustomed to the smell of molasses, but they had not grown accustomed to the sound of the tank creaking and groaning under the pressure. On the day of the disaster, the temperature was unseasonably warm, and the molasses was expanding, putting additional pressure on the tank. As the day wore on, the pressure became too much, and the tank ruptured, sending a wave of molasses through the streets of the North End. But the first sign of trouble came earlier, when a worker at the Purity Distilling Company noticed that the tank was leaking more than usual. He reported the leak to his supervisor, but the company's response was inadequate, and the leak was not properly addressed. As the day wore on, the leak became worse, and the workers' warnings were ignored, setting the stage for the disaster that would soon unfold. The workers' warnings were just the beginning, and soon the entire neighborhood would be affected. As the tank ruptured, the wave of molasses swept through the streets of the North End, destroying everything in its path. The wave was over 25 feet high and traveling at an estimated 35 miles per hour, making it impossible for people to escape. The molasses was everywhere, sticking to everything it touched, making it impossible to move. People were trapped, and the situation was desperate. The first responders were quickly overwhelmed, and the city's emergency services were stretched to the limit. The disaster was getting worse by the minute, and it seemed like nothing could stop it. As the wave receded, the true extent of the damage became clear. Buildings were destroyed, horses were killed, and people were trapped under the molasses. The scene was one of utter chaos, with people screaming and trying to escape. But the worst was yet to come, as the cleanup efforts would soon reveal a horrific sight, one that would haunt the city for decades to come. As the cleanup efforts began, a second wave of disaster struck. The molasses, which had been mixed with seawater from the harbor, began to ferment, producing a toxic gas that filled the air. The gas was deadly, and people who inhaled it began to fall ill. The situation was desperate, and the city's emergency services were stretched to the limit. The second wave of disaster was just as deadly as the first, and it seemed like nothing could stop it. The people of the North End were trapped, and the city was powerless to help them. As the days passed, the situation only got worse, and the death toll continued to rise. The city was in chaos, and it seemed like the disaster would never end. But then a new character emerged, one who would change the course of the investigation and the lives of those affected by the disaster. The introduction of this character would raise more questions than answers, and the truth behind the disaster would slowly begin to unravel. The introduction of the new character, a young journalist named Edward McLaughlin, would change the course of the investigation. McLaughlin, who had been investigating the disaster, discovered that the Purity Distilling Company had been warned about the potential risks of the tank, but had ignored the warnings. The company had also been negligent in their maintenance of the tank and had failed to take proper safety precautions. The evidence was mounting, and it seemed like the company was responsible for the disaster. But then McLaughlin discovered something that would change everything. The tank had been designed by a reputable engineer and had been built to withstand the pressure of the molasses. Something didn't add up, and McLaughlin was determined to get to the bottom of it. As he dug deeper, he found a web of corruption and negligence that went all the way to the top. The truth behind the disaster was more complex than anyone had imagined, and it would take McLaughlin's investigative skills to uncover it. As McLaughlin dug deeper, he found a complex web of corruption and negligence that went all the way to the top. The Purity Distilling Company had been warned about the potential risks of the tank, but had ignored the warnings. The company had also been negligent in their maintenance of the tank and had failed to take proper safety precautions. But that was not all. The city's building codes and regulations had been lax, and the company had taken advantage of them. The city's officials had been corrupt and had turned a blind eye to the company's negligence. The evidence was mounting, and it seemed like the city was just as responsible for the disaster as the company. McLaughlin's investigation had uncovered a dark secret, one that would change the way the city thought about the disaster. The truth behind the Great Molasses Flood was complex, and it would take a deep investigation to uncover it. As McLaughlin continued to investigate, he found more and more evidence of corruption and negligence, and the story became more and more complex. The Great Molasses Flood was not just a disaster, it was a personal tragedy for the people of the North End. The flood killed 21 people and injured over 150. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces and to try to rebuild their lives. One of the survivors, a young woman named Bridget Clufferty, lost her entire family in the disaster. She was just 17 years old and was left alone in the world. The trauma of the disaster would stay with her for the rest of her life, and she would never be the same. The human cost of the disaster was staggering, and it would take years for the community to recover. The people of the North End were resilient, but the disaster had left them scarred. As the years passed, the memory of the disaster would fade, but the impact would remain. The Great Molasses Flood was a tragedy that would never be forgotten, and its impact would be felt for generations to come. In the aftermath of the disaster, the Purity Distilling Company in the city of Boston tried to cover up the true extent of the negligence and corruption that had led to the disaster. The company denied any wrongdoing, and the city tried to shift the blame to the victims. But McLaughlin's investigation had uncovered the truth, and the city and the company were forced to confront it. The cover-up was extensive, and it involved some of the most powerful people in the city. The company had been paying off city officials to look the other way, and the city had been complicit in the company's negligence. The cover-up was a scandal, and it would take years to uncover the full extent of it. As the investigation continued, more and more evidence of the cover-up came to light, and the city and the company were forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The investigation into the Great Molasses Flood was one of the most extensive and complex in the city's history. McLaughlin's investigation had uncovered a web of corruption and negligence, and the city and the company were forced to confront it. The investigation involved numerous agencies, including the police, the fire department, and the city's building department. The investigators found evidence of corruption and negligence at every level, from the company's executives to the city's officials. The investigation was a major scandal, and it would take years to uncover the full extent of the corruption. As the investigation continued, more and more evidence came to light, and the city and the company were forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The investigation was a turning point in the city's history, and it would lead to major reforms in the way the city was governed. The official explanation for the Great Molasses Flood was that it was an accident, a tragic event that could not have been prevented. The company and the city claimed that the tank had been properly maintained, and that the disaster was simply a result of bad luck. But McLaughlin's investigation had uncovered evidence of corruption and negligence, and it was clear that the official explanation was not the whole truth. The company and the city had been trying to cover up the true extent of their negligence, and the official explanation was just a part of the cover-up. As the investigation continued, more and more evidence came to light, and the official explanation was revealed to be a lie. The truth behind the Great Molasses Flood was complex, and it would take a deep investigation to uncover it. The closest truth to what really happened during the Great Molasses Flood is that it was a result of a combination of corruption, negligence, and bad luck. The company had been warned about the potential risks of the tank, but had ignored the warnings. The city had been complicit in the company's negligence and had turned a blind eye to the potential dangers. The disaster was a tragedy, but it was also a preventable one. The investigation had uncovered a web of corruption and negligence, and it was clear that the disaster could have been avoided. The truth behind the Great Molasses Flood was complex, and it would take a deep investigation to uncover it. As the investigation continued, more and more evidence came to light, and the truth behind the disaster was finally revealed. The final revelation was that the Great Molasses Flood was not just a disaster, but a crime. The company and the city had been guilty of negligence and corruption, and the disaster was a result of their actions. The investigation had uncovered a web of corruption and negligence, and it was clear that the disaster could have been avoided. The truth behind the Great Molasses Flood was complex, and it would take a deep investigation to uncover it. The final revelation was a shocking one, and it would change the way the city thought about the disaster. The Great Molasses Flood was a tragedy, but it was also a wake-up call. It was a reminder that corruption and negligence can have deadly consequences, and that the truth must be uncovered. The final revelation was a moment of clarity, and it would lead to major reforms in the way the city was governed. The Great Molasses Flood was a tragedy that would never be forgotten. It was a disaster that was preventable, but it was also a reminder of the importance of uncovering the truth. The investigation had uncovered a web of corruption and negligence, and it had led to major reforms in the way the city was governed. The Great Molasses Flood was a wake-up call, and it would change the way the city thought about disaster prevention and response. The story of the Great Molasses Flood is a complex one, but it is also a reminder of the importance of seeking the truth and holding those in power accountable. If this kept you up at night, subscribe. We post dark history every week.